What does it take for Steve Harvey to stop Family Feud mid-show? What could a mother possibly say that would silence an entire studio and bring a man who spent 4 decades making people laugh to the edge of tears? 3 words. Just 3 words that changed everything. The studio lights were bright that Tuesday afternoon. The cameras were rolling. 2 families stood at their podiums, buzzers ready, competitive energy filling the air. Steve Harvey, in his signature gray suit and purple tie, was doing what he does best, cracking jokes, making the audience roar with laughter, keeping the energy electric. This was supposed to be just another taping. Another episode. Another day at the office for a man who had hosted thousands of these shows. But sometimes life has other plans. Sometimes, a single moment can shatter the carefully constructed walls we build around our emotions. Sometimes 3 words are all it takes to remind us what really matters. The Rodriguez family had made it to the bonus round. Maria Rodriguez, a 38-year-old elementary school teacher from Phoenix, stood alone at the podium. Her family, her husband Carlos, her teenage daughter Sofia, her 10-year-old son Miguel, and her mother Rosa, waited backstage, their fate in her hands. The rules were simple. Answer 5 questions in under 20 seconds, get 200 points or more, win $20,000. Steve walked over to Maria with his trademark swagger, microphone in hand, ready to start the rapid-fire questions. "You ready, Maria?" he asked, flashing that famous smile that had made him America's favorite game show host. Maria nodded, but something in her eyes made Steve pause. It wasn't nervousness. It wasn't excitement. It was something deeper. Something raw. But the show must go on, and Steve had a job to do. "All right, here we go. 20 seconds on the clock." He glanced at his card. "Name something people do when they're stressed." "Pray." Maria answered immediately. "Good answer." Steve moved to the next question. "Name a place where people whisper." "Church." Okay. "Name something you might find in a hospital room." Maria's voice cracked slightly. "Flowers." Steve noticed but kept going. This was television. This was entertainment. "Name something a child asks for every single day." And that's when it happened. Maria's lips trembled. Her eyes filled with tears. And she spoke 3 words that would stop Steve Harvey in his tracks, freeze every person in that studio, and create a moment that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. "My son's voice." The studio went silent. Not the kind of silence that happens during a commercial break. Not the kind that comes from a dramatic pause. This was the silence of collective heartbreak. The kind that happens when an entire room of strangers suddenly feels the weight of another person's pain. Steve Harvey, a man who had interviewed thousands of contestants, who had heard countless stories, who prided himself on keeping the show moving no matter what, Steve Harvey stopped. The microphone lowered to his side. His smile disappeared. And for the first time in his career, he forgot about the cameras, the producers in his earpiece, the ticking clock, the audience at home. He just looked at Maria. Really looked at her. And he saw what the cameras couldn't capture in a wide shot. He saw a mother's grief. He saw loss carved into every line of her face. He saw a woman barely holding herself together, playing a game show while carrying a weight no parent should ever have to bear. "Hold up," Steve said quietly, raising his hand to signal the crew. "Cut. Stop the clock. Stop everything." The studio audience, which had been buzzing with anticipation just moments before, went completely still. Producers in the control room looked at each other in confusion. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't protocol. Steve Harvey didn't stop shows. Steve Harvey kept things moving. Steve Harvey was the professional who could handle anything with a joke and a smile. But this wasn't about being professional anymore. This was about being human. Steve set his cue cards down on the podium. He took off his suit jacket, that expensive, perfectly tailored jacket that was part of his signature look, and draped it over the host stand. Then he did something that would become one of the most powerful moments in game show history. He walked over to Maria Rodriguez and stood beside her. Not as Steve Harvey the host. Not as Steve Harvey the comedian. Just as Steve, a man who understood that some moments transcend entertainment. "Talk to me," he said softly, his voice barely picked up by the studio microphones. "Tell me about your son. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead." Maria's hands gripped the podium as if it was the only thing keeping her standing. The tears she had been fighting back for the past hour, no, the past 6 months, finally broke through. "His name was Daniel," she began, her voice shaking. "He was 7 years old. He had leukemia." The past tense hung in the air like a weight. Had. Was. The words every parent dreads having to use. "Every morning," Maria continued, her words tumbling out now that the dam had broken, "he would wake me up and ask for 3 things. He'd say, 'Mama, can I have pancakes? Mama, can we watch cartoons? Mama, will you read me a story?' Every single day. Even when he was so sick he could barely sit up. Even during the treatments. Even at the end. Steve Harvey, this giant of a man who stood 6'2" and commanded every room he entered, felt his own eyes welling up. Around the studio, audience members were openly crying. Crew members who had seen hundreds of emotional moments were wiping their eyes. Even the competing family, who should have been focused on winning, stood at their podium with tears streaming down their faces. "When did you lose him?" Steve asked gently. 6 months ago. Maria whispered. September 12th. It was a Thursday. He asked me that morning if we could go to the park when he felt better. I said yes. I always said yes. He smiled at me and said, "Okay, Mama. I love you." Those were his last words. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. In his earpiece, the show's producer was frantically trying to get his attention. "Steve, we need to move on. We're way over time. Steve, can you hear me? Steve." Steve reached up and pulled the earpiece out, setting it on the podium beside Maria. He looked directly at the nearest camera and spoke with a clarity and authority that silenced every objection. "I know we've got a show to do. I know there's a format. I know there are rules and time limits and commercial breaks. But right now, none of that matters. Because what's happening right here, right now, is more important than any game show could ever be." He turned back to Maria. "Your son asked you for something every single day. He wanted to hear your voice. He wanted your time. He wanted your love. And you gave it to him. Every single time. Do you understand how precious that is? Do you understand that you gave that little boy exactly what he needed most?" Maria shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "But I couldn't save him. I couldn't make him better. I couldn't." "No," Steve interrupted, his own voice breaking now. "You couldn't cure his disease. But you gave him something even more powerful. You gave him a mother who showed up. Who was present. Who made every single day count. That little boy knew he was loved. He knew it so completely that even now, 6 months later, you can still hear his voice asking for you. That's not loss, Maria. That's legacy." The studio audience erupted. Not with applause, but with something deeper, a collective sob of recognition. Everyone in that room had lost someone. Everyone had regrets. Everyone had asked themselves if they'd done enough, said enough, loved enough. And in Maria's story, they saw their own fears and their own hopes reflected back at them. Steve looked up at the audience, then back at the camera. "Y'all watching at home, I need you to hear this too. We get so caught up in the big things. The cures. The solutions. The fixes. But sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is just show up. Just be present. Just love people while we have them." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, something else that wasn't allowed during taping. He didn't care. He opened his notes app and started typing while everyone watched. When he finished, he held the phone out to Maria. "I want you to have my personal number. Not my business line. Not my assistant's number. Mine. And I want you to know that when you need to talk to someone who understands, when you need to remember that your son's voice matters, when you need to know that you're not alone, you call me. Anytime. Day or night. You hear me?" Maria stared at the phone number through her tears, unable to speak. Steve gently took her hand and closed her fingers around the phone. Then he did something that would become the defining image of this moment. He pulled her into a hug. A real hug. Not a brief, cameras are rolling hug. A genuine embrace that said, "I see you. I hear you. Your pain matters." But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. From backstage, Maria's family had been watching on monitors. Her husband Carlos, her daughter Sofia, her son Miguel, her mother Rosa, they had heard everything. And now, without asking permission, without waiting for direction, they walked onto the set. The competing family, the Martinez clan from Texas, saw them coming. And instead of staying at their podium, instead of maintaining the artificial separation that game show competition requires, they did something remarkable. They walked over too. Within seconds, both families surrounded Maria and Steve in the middle of the Family Feud stage. Arms around shoulders. Hands clasped. Strangers united in shared grief and shared humanity. The host podium was abandoned. The game boards went dark. The carefully choreographed television show dissolved into something far more powerful, a moment of genuine human connection. Steve Harvey stood in the center of it all, one arm still around Maria, surrounded by people who minutes ago had been competitors and were now simply humans supporting another human through pain. He looked at the cameras, at the crew, at the audience, and he spoke with the kind of raw honesty that rarely makes it onto television. "This is what matters," he said, his voice steady despite the tears on his face. "Not the money. Not the points. Not the game. This right here. This is what we're supposed to be doing for each other." The studio audience rose to their feet. Not in applause, but in solidarity. One by one, they stood until every single person in that room was on their feet, bearing witness to this moment of profound humanity. Steve looked down at Maria, who was now surrounded by love from every direction. "Your son asked for your voice every day because your voice meant safety. It meant love. It meant home. And Maria, I need you to understand something. His voice isn't gone. It's right there in your heart, asking you the same thing it always did. Asking you to keep living. To keep loving. To keep showing up. That's what he'd want. That's what he's still asking for." Maria nodded through her sobs, and for the first time since her son's death, something shifted inside her. The weight didn't disappear, grief never fully leaves. But it transformed from something that was crushing her into something she could carry. Because she wasn't carrying it alone anymore. Steve turned to the producers. "I don't care what the rules say. I don't care about the format. Both families win today. Both families get the prize money. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me." No one had a problem with it. How could they? What they had all just witnessed transcended game shows and television and entertainment. They had seen what happens when someone with a platform chooses to use it for something more important than ratings. They had seen what happens when humanity breaks through the carefully constructed walls of professional polish. They had seen Steve Harvey, comedian and host, step aside to let Steve Harvey, human being, take center stage. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. As the families finally separated and the studio tried to return to some semblance of normal, Steve did one more thing. He walked over to his suit jacket, the one he had draped over the host stand at the beginning of this extraordinary detour, and he handed it to Maria. "This is for Daniel," he said simply. "I want you to keep this. And whenever you need to remember that your son's voice mattered, that your love mattered, that you did everything right, you look at this jacket, and you remember this day. You remember that a whole studio full of people stopped everything to honor your son's memory. That's powerful, Maria. That's legacy." Maria clutched the jacket to her chest, and in that moment, it became more than a piece of clothing. It became a symbol. A reminder. A tangible representation of the day the world stopped and said, "Your grief matters. Your son matters. You matter." The episode never aired the way it was filmed. But the clip leaked online, and within days millions had watched it. Not for entertainment. Not for laughs. But to witness what happens when compassion interrupts commerce, when humanity breaks through performance, when a man with a microphone chooses to use his voice for something bigger than a punchline. Steve Harvey went back to hosting Family Feud the next day. But something had changed. He carried Maria's story with him. He carried Daniel's voice with him. And every time a contestant stood at that podium, he saw them a little differently. Not as players in a game, but as people carrying invisible weights, fighting invisible battles, showing up despite unimaginable pain. That's the legacy of 3 words. That's the power of a mother's answer. That's what happens when we stop long enough to listen, really listen, to each other's pain. Daniel Rodriguez asked for his mother's voice every single day. And on that Tuesday afternoon in a television studio, his mother's voice was finally heard by the world. Not because she won a game, but because she reminded us all what it means to be human.